First question, when and where were you born?
Actually, I was born in Ingelheim in Germany back in 1920, which makes me a 92-year-old. So if I don't hear your question later on, you may have to repeat it, because part of age is a decline in a part of hearing. But I most certainly am glad to be back in among the 16-year-olds, because the story that we will talk about occurred pretty much subsequent to that particular age period. And for that...
Right, so when the Nazis came to power, which was in 1933, you were around 13 years old.
That is correct.
So once the Nazis came to power in the 33, how did life begin to change?
Well, first of all, the Nazis came into power with a concept that the Germans were the Herrenvolk, namely that the Germans were to be the masters, and they had a quality that was superior to the quality of other countries. They believed that the other countries, the Slavs and others, other racial groups, were to be managed by the Herrenvolk, namely the master race. They believed that Germans were a master race, that they had to control the rest of the populace, meaning the rest of the world. In Germany, which at that time had about 60 million people, the Jews were less than 1% of the populace. 60 million Germans, 500,000 believed in the Jewish faith. Hitler had come to power with the looking at Jews as being less than human. What happened after he came to power, within a couple of days, concentration camps were established. The opposition, the head of the opposition, ended up in the concentration camp or in jail, which meant that after he had gained power, he had been appointed by President Hindenburg to be the chancellor, and he had formed a cabinet of the parties of the right. While his party at that particular time had more than 30% of the populace in terms of voting, the voting populace, he gathered the members of the right and included them in a cabinet, which then gave him a bare majority. After he came to power, he immediately went after the leaders of the opposition, and they ended up in either concentration camps, as I just said, or in jail. And those that did not knew that they too would be next on the line, which meant that in the Reichstag, which is the equivalent of the Congress here in the United States, he, at that particular point, had a majority, because the opposition parties were beheaded. The members, the leaders of the opposition parties ended up in prison. So as a result of it, a number of things happened. As far as the minority of Jews were concerned, the 500,000 Jews that existed in Germany, lived in Germany, they found that those that were teachers or public servants, by the middle of the year, were discharged. What was the reason? The fact that they were Jews. Within a couple of years, physicians, Jewish physicians, were only permitted to treat Jews. In other words, out of the 60 million total populace, 500,000 were Jews. The physicians could only treat the Jews. So restrictions started coming in. By the middle of the year, As a matter of fact, one of the people that was immediately discharged was a man whose name you may be familiar, Albert Einstein. As a matter of fact, when Hitler came to power, Einstein happened to be lecturing here in the United States. He was discharged, and Princeton was only too happy to have him join their faculty. By the middle of the year, what they did is burn the books of those that either were Jews or opposition to their particular philosophy. So you had book burning from the house that I lived in. I could watch the burning of the books at a little mountain that was within sight. And they took the attitude, by burning the books, all ideas other than their own would prevail. And that immediately caused the changes with respect to the minority, in this particular case, the Jews. By the middle of the year, a boycott was put in place, and the members of the party, Nazi party, were marching up in front of businesses that were Jewish-owned and urged the potential purchasers of certain goods not to cater to the Jewish-owned firms. And that's what changed for Jews in particular.
So basically, so that affected the fact that with the Depression and the fact that they could only have 500,000 people to be customers, it made it even more so that they needed to find other places to go.
They needed what?
They needed like other places to go, is that correct?
Right. It became obvious very early on that anyone who would hope to earn a livelihood in Germany, any Jew who hoped to earn a livelihood in Germany would not be able to do so, which meant that this minority would look to other places where they could emigrate. Now, we are talking about the 1930s, and the 1930s represented a depression, an economic depression. They were unemployed in the United States and many other countries. So the borders were closed. Now, when we talk about Europe and America and Asia, the distances were greater than they are today, because in order to come to the United States, the only means of transportation was a steamship, and that took anywhere from 4 to 5 days, depending on the wind condition. We anticipate, if we go to Europe or to Asia, within a couple of hours, we will have arrived at our destination. Back in the 1930s, in fact, we're talking about a period, in fact, Charles Lindbergh crossed the ocean back in the late 1920s in a monoplane. So regular air traffic occurred subsequent to that particular period. The only way anyone from either Asia or Europe wanted to come to the United States was by steamship, and that was a couple of days a journey.
So clearly, obviously things weren't going well. And then subsequently came November 9th, 1938, which was Kristallnacht. And that's when things, even though the Nazis have exhibited signs of violence, that's when things really became violent, would you say? Like, what was your experience with Kristallnacht itself?
Well, let me just set the stage, and you may recall how it all happened. Back in early 1938,